What if the sweet, apron-wearing Ampy wasn't as gentle off-camera as she seemed? And what if the sassy, sarcastic Ethel Mertz was even sharper in real life? So much so that she left a trail of burned bridges, legal demands, and co-stars who refused to ever work with her again. It sounds like something cooked up in a tabloid, until you dig into the real history of Frances Bavier and Vivian Vance. You've seen them on two of the most beloved TV shows in history, The Andy Griffith Show and I Love Lucy. Their characters brought warmth and wit into millions of American homes. But behind the scenes, it was a whole different story. Both women were deeply complex, sometimes difficult, and fiercely protective of their work. And while they never starred in the same show, stories began surfacing that suggest Frances Bavier harbored strong feelings about Vivian Vance, and not the friendly kind. Now, the truth is finally coming out. For decades, their names were spoken with respect, nostalgia, and even a little awe. But among industry insiders and those who worked on the sets, there were whispers of cold shoulders, harsh words, and even legal clauses put in place to make sure certain co-stars never shared a screen again. Some claimed Bavier disliked Vivian's larger-than-life personality. Others said it went deeper, that it was about control, status, and the struggle to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry. It wasn't just two women clashing. It was two stars trying to survive in unforgiving Hollywood that rarely made room for strong, older women. Frances Bavier was known for being difficult. Some would even say icy, especially toward her co-stars. She was famously reclusive in her later years, refusing interviews, avoiding reunions, and cutting off most of her colleagues. And Vivian Vance? She was no stranger to conflict either. She loathed her I Love Lucy co-star William Frawley so much that she made sure a clause in her contract banned him from appearing in her later shows. That's not Hollywood drama. That's real-life tension written into a legal document. So when fans started connecting the dots, the idea that Bavier and Vance didn't exactly get along began to sound more and more believable. Two headstrong actresses, both weary of being typecast, both exhausted from carrying iconic shows on their backs, crossing paths in the tightly knit world of classic television. It was only a matter of time before friction turned to resentment. But what was it really about? Was it personality, ego, or something deeper? Because while most feuds get smoothed over with time, this one never did. Even decades later, neither woman ever spoke publicly about the other. That silence? It may have said more than words ever could. And as you'll see next, it wasn't the only time Vivian Vance found herself at odds with the people she worked with. It's one of the greatest ironies in TV history. The couple that made America laugh together absolutely couldn't stand each other off-screen. Vivian Vance and William Frawley, better known as Ethel and Fred Mertz, were supposed to be lovable, bickering spouses on I Love Lucy. But the bickering didn't stop when the cameras turned off. In fact, the feud behind the scenes ran so deep, it lasted for decades and became one of the most notorious grudges in early television. The tension started on day one. Vivian Vance was elegant, sharp, and stage-trained. When she learned that William Frawley, a gruff, heavy-drinking actor 22 years her senior, was cast as her husband, she was furious. According to multiple reports, she openly complained that no one would believe someone as young and attractive as her would ever marry a man that old and cranky. Frawley, who already had a reputation for having a short fuse, took that personally, very personally. From that moment on, it was war. Frawley never forgave her for what he saw as an insult to his age, his looks, and his career. And he didn't keep quiet about it either. He started calling her names behind the scenes, mocking her weight, her attitude, and even her acting. In return, Vance refused to socialize with him, made no effort to hide her disgust, and allegedly pushed producers to limit his involvement in scenes. But here's the twist. Despite all the hostility, the two of them had undeniable on-screen chemistry. The audience loved Fred and Ethel. Their banter, their timing, all worked. Maybe that's because the bitterness was real. Every sarcastic jab and exhausted sigh wasn't just acting. It was a genuine release of frustration between two people forced to work together for years. Lucille Ball, who was close to both, tried to keep the peace, but it was a losing battle. The feud reached its peak after I Love Lucy ended. When Ball began her new show, The Lucy Show, and invited Vance to return, she agreed, on one condition. William Frawley would never, under any circumstances, be allowed on set. She didn't just request it. She had it written into her contract. That's how badly she wanted to keep him out of her life. And Frawley? He was reportedly just as bitter. When Vance won an Emmy, he famously muttered, "I think Vivian's happy. She finally got something she didn't complain about." Even when he was offered a spot on a reunion special years later, he declined, saying he didn't want to be anywhere near her. This wasn't a case of clashing personalities that cooled over time. The hatred was mutual, public, and permanent, and it left a mark, not just on their careers, but on everyone around them, even decades later. TV historians point to the Fred and Ethel feud as one of the most intense in classic Hollywood. But Vivian wasn't done making enemies. In fact, there was one actress whose silence spoke louder than words, and Frances Bavier may have had even stronger feelings about her than Frawley ever did. In Hollywood, personal grudges usually stay hidden. Whispers in studio hallways, silent tensions at award shows. But Vivian Vance didn't believe in keeping things quiet. When it came to her working relationships, she didn't just speak her mind, she put it in writing. And one particular clause in her contract would go down as one of the boldest moves ever pulled by a TV actress in the 1960s. After I Love Lucy wrapped in 1957, Lucille Ball wasn't done. She wanted to keep her comedic empire alive and asked Vivian to join her on a new show, The Lucy Show. At first, Vance hesitated. She was tired of playing second fiddle, tired of the frumpy wardrobe, and, most of all, tired of the baggage that came with I Love Lucy. But Ball offered her more creative control, better pay, and a promise that things would be different this time around. Vivian agreed, with one condition. William Frawley would never be allowed anywhere near production. This wasn't a verbal promise. This was legal. Vivian's team made sure it was in her contract that Frawley, under no circumstances, would appear as a guest star, background actor, or even step onto the set. That kind of clause was almost unheard of in that era, especially for a woman in a male-dominated industry. But Vivian had had enough. She didn't just want a clean slate. She wanted to erase the past. The clause sent a message loud and clear. Vivian Vance would no longer tolerate being disrespected behind the scenes. She had spent years dealing with Frawley's bitterness, the backhanded comments, the eye rolls between takes. This clause was her revenge, and more importantly, it was her protection. But Hollywood has a long memory, and for some, that level of control didn't sit well. Behind closed doors, other actors and studio veterans took note. Not everyone admired her move. Some saw it as bold. Others saw it as petty. Frances Bavier, known for her no-nonsense attitude and old-school sensibilities, was reportedly one of those people. While there's no public record of direct interaction between Vance and Bavier, they existed in the same tight-knit orbit of classic television. Their careers overlapped during the golden age of American sitcoms, and it's widely known that Bavier disliked the politics and egos that came with stardom. She often kept to herself, stayed distant from her co-stars, and later rejected nearly every attempt at a public reunion or interview. So when word spread that Vivian Vance had forced producers to legally ban a co-star just to stay comfortable, it likely didn't land well with Frances. To someone who saw herself as professional above all else, Vance's decision may have looked like diva behavior, a red flag of someone who put personal drama before the craft. And that perception would only deepen as Bavier watched Vance continue to command attention, stir headlines, and, whether intentionally or not, stir the pot. But the real question is, was Frances Bavier really that different from Vivian Vance? The answer is more complicated than you might think. To millions of fans, Frances Bavier was Aunt B, the warm, gentle, pie-baking heart of the Andy Griffith Show. But the woman behind the character? She couldn't have been more different. Beneath the soft-spoken exterior was an actress known for her stern temper, icy demeanor, and complete disdain for Hollywood's fake smiles and backroom politics. Frances didn't just walk away from fame. She ran from it. And the further she got from the spotlight, the clearer it became. Something about the business had left her bitter and maybe even angry. During the show's run in the 1960s, Bavier was already struggling behind the scenes. While Andy Griffith and the rest of the cast formed a tight bond filled with laughter and camaraderie, Frances often kept her distance. She had a reputation for being difficult, short-tempered, and uninterested in small talk. Even Andy Griffith himself admitted, years later, that their relationship was strained. She reportedly clashed with cast members, disapproved of how the set was run, and felt like she was never truly respected for her craft. And it only got worse after the cameras stopped rolling. When the Andy Griffith show ended, most of the cast stayed in the public eye, appearing in interviews, talk shows, and reunion specials. But Frances disappeared. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be remembered, at least not by Hollywood. She declined multiple invitations to reunite with the cast, including the high-profile return to Mayberry TV movie in 1986. Even when Ron Howard personally reached out to ask her to come back, she politely, but firmly, said no. Instead, she spent her final years alone in Siler City, North Carolina. Locals describe her as quiet, sometimes cold, and intensely private. She rarely left her home and barely spoke to neighbors. It was a sharp contrast from the loving, grandmotherly figure fans knew from TV. Many were shocked to learn that Ampie had chosen solitude over legacy. But maybe it wasn't choice. Maybe it was a reaction to the way Hollywood treated older actresses, to the roles she was typecast into, and to the politics she despised. Like Vivian Vance, Frances had strong opinions. But unlike Vivian, she never fought loudly or publicly. She simply walked away and shut the door behind her. And here's where the story gets interesting. When reports started surfacing about Bavier's negative comments on other classic TV stars, including criticisms about how certain actresses carried themselves or disrespected tradition, many began speculating she was referring to people like Vivian Vance, women who were bold, loud, and unapologetic, women who controlled their image and fought for power on their terms. The kind of women Frances may have quietly resented. It wasn't an open feud. There were no headlines or slaps backstage. But in a world as small as early television, those silences, those side eyes and icy rejections, said more than words ever could. And when you line up their careers side by side, you begin to see it clearly. These two women weren't just different. They were opposites. Hollywood didn't need fireworks to create a feud. Sometimes, all it took was two strong personalities walking in opposite directions. Each convinced the other was the problem. That's exactly what happened between Frances Bavier and Vivian Vance. While they never shared a set, their reputations, outlooks, and values clashed so starkly that even from a distance, the tension was real. Vivian Vance was Hollywood's survivor. Outspoken, sharp, and witty, she clawed her way into the spotlight and refused to be treated like a background character. Even when I Love Lucy typecast her as a funny sidekick, she pushed back behind the scenes, fighting for better lines, better pay, and more respect. When producers and executives tried to box her in, she broke out, publicly demanding fairness at a time when most women stayed silent. Frances Bavier was the opposite, reserved, formal, and deeply traditional. She didn't want fame. She wanted respect. Her roots were on the stage, and she treated acting like a sacred craft. To her, television was often too fast, too shallow, and too political. While other stars schmoozed and smiled, Bavier kept her distance. And that included from actors she felt were too flashy, too confrontational, or worse, too self-promoting. And Vivian? She was all of the above. Industry insiders who knew both women began connecting the dots. Bavier had once reportedly criticized female stars who thought they were bigger than the show. She believed television was about ensemble work, not personal stardom. But Vivian Vance never played by those rules. She believed that if she didn't fight for her own worth, no one else would. And she was right. Still, to someone like Bavier, that approach might look like arrogance or disrespect. On the surface, they had a lot in common. Both were typecast, both struggled with being taken seriously, and both carried personal pain behind their performances. But the way they responded to that pain couldn't have been more different. Vivian externalized it, fighting, talking, confronting. Frances internalized it, retreating, resenting, and eventually disappearing altogether. Rumors even circulated in studio circles that Bavier had blocked certain names from projects she worked on. While Vivian's contract clause to block William Frawley was public knowledge, Bavier kept her moves quiet. Some believed she had a mental list of co-stars she refused to be associated with, and Vance, with her loud persona and tabloid attention, was allegedly one of them. No one ever caught them arguing. No microphones picked up a tense exchange. But sometimes silence is louder than shouting. Bavier never praised Vance, never acknowledged her career, and in the rare interviews she gave, she danced around any mention of actors she didn't admire. To those who knew the business, it was clear there was no love lost between these two TV legends. The rivalry may not have made headlines, but in the small, interconnected world of classic television, it was obvious. Frances Bavier didn't just dislike Vivian Vance. She likely stood for everything Bavier wanted to avoid. But that wasn't the end of it. Because even in their final years, their stories continue to drift in opposite directions, and their legacies reveal something few fans ever realized. As the golden age of television faded into reruns and nostalgia, both Frances Bavier and Vivian Vance stepped away from the spotlight. But the way they each exited told us everything we needed to know about who they really were. Vivian Vance never truly retired. Even as health problems crept in, she continued appearing on talk shows, making guest spots, and giving interviews with that same sharp wit audiences adored. She laughed about her time on I Love Lucy, made peace with the frumpy costumes and second fiddle scripts, and stayed close to Lucille Ball until the end. But behind the smiles was pain, years of battling clinical depression, struggles with body image, and eventually a fight with cancer that would take her life in 1979. She spent her final years in Belvedere, California, in a peaceful home with her beloved husband and friends. Visitors said she was vibrant to the end, cracking jokes even when she could barely speak. There was a sense that Vivian had found something like peace, not because Hollywood had been kind to her, but because she had finally stopped letting it define her. Frances Bavier's final chapter was hauntingly different. After years of turning down reunions and declining interviews, Bavier vanished into small-town North Carolina, buying a modest house and living alone with a dozen cats. She refused nearly every media request. She didn't sign autographs. And when people approached her with warmth and nostalgia, expecting Aunt B, they were often met with a polite but cold brush-off. Locals later said she seemed lonely, quiet, guarded, but not unkind, just distant, as if she was carrying something too heavy to explain. She once told a reporter, reluctantly, that she regretted how she treated some of her castmates. Many assumed she was referring to Andy Griffith, but some speculated her words carried more weight, hinting at a broader bitterness about the industry and perhaps the people she clashed with along the way. Bavier passed away in 1989, completely removed from the world that once made her famous. No dramatic goodbyes, no farewell interviews, just silence. And that silence left fans with questions. Why did she pull away so sharply? Why did she seem to harbor such quiet resentment? And who exactly were the unnamed people she criticized in those rare, cryptic remarks? Though never confirmed, many believe Vivian Vance was one of them. A symbol of everything Bavier disliked about how television was changing. Louder personalities, more self-promotion, and less reverence for the ensemble. In death, the contrast between the two became even sharper. Vivian was remembered with laughter, warmth, and televised tributes. Frances was remembered with mystery, solitude, and quiet respect. But perhaps the strangest part of all, Despite never going head-to-head publicly, their stories remain forever linked. Two icons shaped by the same industry, yet divided by personality, philosophy, and pride. And in the end, fans are still left wondering, what would have happened if they had crossed paths on screen? In the grand tapestry of Hollywood rivalries, some explode in public view, shouting matches, tabloid wars, dramatic walk-offs. But others simmer quietly beneath the surface, known only to those who understand how deep egos, reputations, and philosophies can divide even the most legendary stars. The story of Frances Bavier and Vivian Vance falls into that second category, a cold, quiet, and eerily fascinating tension that never made headlines, but left behind whispers that still echo today. They never had a public spat. There were no dramatic feuds on set or explosive interviews. But when you examine their careers side by side, the way they worked, the way they spoke about their peers, the way they exited the spotlight, it becomes clear these two women stood on opposite ends of the same storm. Vivian Vance was the rule breaker. She challenged the roles handed to her, rewrote the script, sometimes literally, and wasn't afraid to burn bridges if it meant standing up for herself. She was the kind of woman who forced Hollywood to reckon with its treatment of women, especially those who weren't young, glamorous, or willing to stay silent. She laughed in public, cried in private, and lived with an intensity that never really faded, even as her health failed. Frances Bavier, on the other hand, was the traditionalist. She believed in rules, structure, and respect for the craft. She didn't fight in public. She simply withdrew. To her, the rise of outspoken stars like Vivian may have seemed like the unraveling of the dignity she believed acting was supposed to represent. Her silence wasn't indifference. It was protest. And yet, both were victims of the same system. Typecast, misunderstood, and in many ways, never fully appreciated while alive. The industry celebrated the characters they portrayed, Aunt B, Ethel Mertz, but rarely acknowledged the emotional cost of becoming those icons. In different ways, both women paid for their success. So did Frances Bavier truly hate Vivian Vance? The word may be too strong or not strong enough. What's more accurate is that she likely couldn't understand her, couldn't relate to her boldness, her willingness to air dirty laundry, or her need to fight publicly for validation. To someone like Frances, that wasn't strength. It was ego. And in a business where reputations travel faster than scripts, that quiet judgment may have been mutual. In the end, it wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about two women shaped by their time, their pain, and their principles. And maybe that's what still fascinates fans all these years later. The contrast, the mystery, the story between the lines. It's a reminder that not every feud needs fireworks. Sometimes, a quiet rivalry speaks louder than any on-screen drama ever could. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into classic Hollywood, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss our next Untold story. Who do you want us to cover next? Let us know in the comments below.